The cruelest prisons are not built with iron bars, but with the quiet lies repeated until the whole world believes them. Every morning before dawn painted the Northumberland coast with pale silver light. Rosalie Winford crossed the dew-covered paths of Windermere Glass Conservatory carrying nothing more than a woven basket and a small pair of pruning shears that had once belonged to her father. The enormous Victorian greenhouse stretched across nearly 4 acres, its towering glass ceiling capturing the first rays of sunrise until thousands of blossoms glowed like scattered jewels beneath crystal walls. Roses climbed graceful iron arches, white orchids rested beside marble fountains, and fragrant citrus trees filled the warm air with a sweetness that made strangers forget the harsh winds blowing in from the sea. It had once been the pride of the Winford family, admired by noble visitors from every corner of the kingdom, but those days had faded with the passing of Rosalie's father. Since then, the estate had belonged only on paper to the family whose name it carried. In truth, every hallway, every garden path, and every elegant room answered only to Vivian Winford, the woman who had married Rosalie's father during the final years of his illness. Vivian possessed the polished smile of a gracious hostess, but behind closed doors, her kindness dissolved as quickly as frost beneath the spring sun. To society she appeared devoted and refined. To Rosalie she was simply the voice that transformed every sunrise into another test of quiet endurance. "Those roses don't admire themselves," Vivian often reminded her while sipping tea beneath the veranda. "Beauty exists to serve someone greater." Rosalie never argued. She merely lowered her eyes and continued trimming each fragile bloom with careful hands, believing flowers deserved gentleness even when people did not. Her stepsisters, Clarissa and Penelope, rarely entered the conservatory unless guests accompanied them. They disliked the humidity that softened expensive gowns and complained endlessly about the scent of soil lingering in the air. Instead, they preferred polished mirrors, silk ribbons, sparkling jewels, and endless conversations about the upcoming Royal Court exhibition, where the highest families in England would gather before the king and his advisors. This year's celebration carried even greater excitement because Duke Theodore Ashcroft, whose estates overlooked the northern cliffs beyond Blackstone Bay, was expected to attend after years of avoiding court ceremonies. Every newspaper praised his discipline, his generosity towards struggling fishing villages, and his calm authority. Mothers dreamed of introducing daughters to him. Noblemen hoped for his friendship. Servants whispered that even hardened judges listened when the Duke chose to speak. Rosalie had never seen him, though she occasionally noticed a lone rider crossing distant cliffs at sunrise while she watered climbing roses near the eastern glass wall. Whoever the rider was, he always paused for only a few moments before disappearing into the sea mist, leaving behind nothing except unanswered curiosity. "Stop staring outside," Clarissa scoffed one morning as she wandered through the greenhouse wearing a pale blue gown entirely unsuited for gardening. "Girls like you shouldn't waste time imagining fairy tales." Penelope laughed while examining her own reflection in one of the polished glass panels. "Besides, no duke has ever crossed an entire kingdom searching for a gardener." Their laughter echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling before drifting away among the flowering vines. Rosalie smiled faintly without replying. She had learned long ago that silence often preserved dignity better than clever words. She knelt beside an aging white rose whose outer petals had begun to curl from an unexpected cold spell. Gently supporting its stem, she trimmed only what could no longer bloom, whispering almost inaudibly, "You'll blossom again." The old groundskeeper standing several yards away watched her with quiet admiration. "Your father used to say the very same thing," he murmured. Rosalie's fingers paused. For just a heartbeat, memories returned of warm laughter, soil-covered gloves, and evenings spent planning new gardens beneath lantern light. Then Vivian's sharp voice sliced through the peaceful air from the entrance. "Rosalie! Leave those flowers. We have far more important preparations to make. The Royal Court exhibition begins in 3 days, and from this moment forward, every mistake you make reflects upon this family." Rosalie stood immediately, brushing loose petals from her simple linen dress. She did not yet know that those 3 days would change every corner of her life, or that hidden behind polished smiles, someone had already begun weaving a plan designed not merely to shame her, but to erase the very beauty that quietly bloomed within her. Rosalie followed Vivian through the winding stone corridors of Windermere House, where portraits of long-departed ancestors watched from gilded frames with expressions that seemed almost sorrowful beneath the afternoon light. The conservatory's comforting warmth faded behind her, replaced by polished marble floors that reflected every measured step. The house had once welcomed musicians, scholars, and distinguished botanists who admired her father's remarkable collection of rare flowers. Now the grand halls echoed mostly with discussions of wealth, titles, and appearances. Vivian stopped before the drawing room where bolts of expensive fabric, polished jewelry boxes, and embroidered gloves had been carefully arranged across velvet chairs. Clarissa stood before a full-length mirror while a seamstress adjusted the sleeves of a lavender silk gown trimmed with delicate pearls. Penelope admired a collection of jeweled hair combs, lifting each one beneath the window until tiny flashes of light danced across the ceiling. Neither sister acknowledged Rosalie's arrival. Vivian slowly circled her stepdaughter with the practiced gaze of someone inspecting an object rather than a person. "The Royal Court exhibition welcomes only those who know their place," she said calmly. "Your father spoiled you with impossible dreams. I will not make the same mistake." Rosalie folded her hands quietly before her. "I understand." Vivian offered a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "Do you? Then you will remain useful. You shall accompany us, but only as an attendant. You will carry our belongings, arrange our flowers, and remain behind us at all times. No unnecessary conversation. No drawing attention to yourself." Clarissa finally turned from the mirror. "She should not wear blue," she remarked. "It makes her eyes too noticeable." Penelope nodded in agreement. "Or cream. Father once said cream suited her best." Vivian considered their words before walking toward an old cedar wardrobe standing against the far wall. She opened it slowly and removed a faded brown dress that looked several seasons out of fashion. Its fabric remained clean but plain, its color nearly identical to the dried branches stacked beside the estate's garden walls each autumn. "This will do," Vivian declared. "Simple. Forgettable." Rosalie accepted the folded dress without protest. She had learned that preserving peace often required surrendering comforts that could never define her worth. As she turned toward the door, Clarissa spoke again with quiet satisfaction. "The exhibition will be filled with noble ladies wearing imported silk from Paris and jewels from Vienna. Imagine arriving beside someone dressed like that." Laughter filled the room, light and polished enough that anyone passing through the hallway might mistake it for harmless amusement. Rosalie continued walking without looking back. Outside, the sea breeze carried the familiar scent of salt across the gardens as she returned to the conservatory. There, surrounded once again by blooming roses and climbing jasmine, the weight pressing against her chest eased almost immediately. The old groundskeeper, Mr. Edwin Hale, noticed the bundle in her hands before saying a single word. "A different dress?" he asked gently. Rosalie unfolded the faded garment across a nearby wooden bench. "It is suitable for someone expected to remain invisible." Mr. Hale studied the dress before looking toward the endless rows of flowers stretching beneath the glass ceiling. "Your father believed flowers never competed with one another," he said quietly. "A white rose does not envy a crimson one. Each blooms according to the light it receives." Rosalie smiled softly while reaching for a watering can. "Perhaps people forget that." They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing arrangements destined for the exhibition. Rosalie selected blossoms with remarkable care, balancing soft ivory roses beside deep blue delphiniums and fragrant lilies whose petals seemed almost luminous beneath the afternoon sun. Every bouquet reflected harmony rather than extravagance. Even the smallest arrangement carried the quiet elegance her father had taught her years before. Unknown to everyone inside the conservatory, a horse slowed near the eastern stone wall overlooking the estate. Duke Theodore Ashcroft guided his dark bay gelding to a stop, his attention captured not by the magnificent greenhouse itself but by the young woman arranging flowers with patient concentration. From that distance he could not hear her voice, yet something about the calm rhythm of her movements contrasted sharply with the hurried world surrounding the approaching exhibition. She paused only once to rescue a small butterfly that had become trapped beneath a ribbon resting on the worktable before releasing it toward the open skylight. Theodore watched the tiny creature disappear into the sunlight, then observed the quiet smile crossing the young woman's face before she returned to her work as though no kindness, however small, should ever be delayed. His steward, riding several yards behind, cleared his throat politely. "Your Grace, the council meeting begins within the hour." Theodore lingered another moment before gathering the reins. "Yes," he answered thoughtfully, his eyes leaving the greenhouse at last. "But some places are worth remembering." As the horses disappeared beyond the tree-lined drive, Rosalie looked briefly toward the distant cliffs without knowing why a sudden feeling urged her to lift her eyes. She saw only the fading outline of two riders against the golden evening sky while, inside the manor, Vivian quietly unfolded another layer of a plan that had nothing to do with dresses alone and everything to do with ensuring that, when the doors of the royal court finally opened, Rosalie Winford would become someone the world would choose not to see. The morning before the royal court exhibition arrived wrapped in a blanket of grey clouds drifting above the Northumberland shoreline, and the entire Windermere estate stirred with unusual urgency. Carriages rolled across the circular drive carrying crates of fresh flowers, polished silver display stands, and carefully packed porcelain vases destined for the grand exhibition hall. Servants hurried through the corridors balancing hatboxes, garment bags, and travel trunks while Vivian directed every movement with flawless precision, determined that nothing less than perfection would represent the Winford name. Rosalie had risen before sunrise, as always, to gather the final blooms from the conservatory. She selected each flower with thoughtful care, making certain that every stem was healthy, every blossom fully opened, and every arrangement reflected quiet harmony rather than excessive display. By the time the first carriage stood ready outside, more than 200 fresh flowers rested inside handcrafted wooden crates lined with soft linen. Mr. Edwin Hale carefully secured the final lid before smiling at Rosalie. "Your father would have been proud to see these arrangements." Rosalie lowered her eyes with gentle gratitude. "I only followed what he taught me." Before another word could be spoken, Vivian entered the conservatory accompanied by Clarissa and Penelope, both dressed in elegant traveling gowns trimmed with delicate embroidery that shimmered beneath the morning light filtering through the glass ceiling. Vivian slowly examined every crate before stopping beside the largest arrangement, where dozens of ivory climbing roses curved gracefully around pale blue delphiniums. "Too beautiful," she said calmly. Rosalie looked up in confusion. "I believed this would become the centerpiece display." Vivian's smile remained perfectly composed. "Exactly why it cannot remain as it is." Without raising her voice, she lifted several of the finest roses from the arrangement and handed them to Clarissa. "These belong in your presentation." She selected another cluster of blossoms for Penelope before removing additional flowers until the once breathtaking display appeared noticeably diminished. Rosalie watched silently as the balance she had spent hours creating disappeared piece by piece. "Now," Vivian continued, "replace those missing flowers with the ordinary white carnations from the storage room." Clarissa admired the roses now decorating her own arrangement. "Much better. People always remember what is placed in front of them." Rosalie quietly carried out the instructions. She understood that arguing would accomplish nothing except delay the departure. Yet even as she inserted the simpler flowers into the arrangement, she took care to position each bloom so gracefully that the finished display still possessed quiet dignity. Mr. Hale noticed her patience, and shook his head almost imperceptibly, recognizing once again that kindness remained her greatest strength. Shortly afterward, everyone gathered outside as the carriages prepared to leave. Clarissa climbed into the first carriage beside Vivian, while Penelope occupied the opposite seat surrounded by elegant hatboxes and carefully wrapped bouquets. Rosalie approached carrying a final crate only to hear Vivian's measured voice once again. "Not inside." Rosalie paused. "Where would you like me to ride?" Vivian gestured toward the rear supply carriage already filled with wooden boxes, folded display tables, and gardening equipment. There is enough room beside the flower crates. After all, you are traveling with the flowers. Clarissa laughed softly. She has always preferred the company of roses anyway. Rosalie simply nodded before climbing into the rear carriage without complaint. The journey toward the Royal Court exhibition lasted nearly 3 hours, following winding coastal roads lined with towering cliffs and rolling fields brightened by patches of late spring wildflowers. While the family traveled comfortably ahead, Rosalie remained seated among the flower crates, carefully steadying them whenever the carriage crossed uneven ground. Through the open rear window she watched seabirds gliding above crashing waves, drawing quiet comfort from the endless rhythm of the ocean. At midday the procession reached Aldermere Palace, where the exhibition occupied magnificent gardens surrounding an elegant marble pavilion overlooking the sea. Hundreds of workers moved across the grounds arranging banners, fountains, and elaborate floral displays while noble families arrived one after another in polished coaches bearing colorful family crests. Everywhere Rosalie looked she saw shimmering gowns, tailored coats, polished boots, and glittering jewelry reflecting the afternoon sunlight. She immediately began unloading the flower crates, working alongside several palace gardeners who greeted her with unexpected warmth. One elderly gardener paused while examining her arrangements. "Who designed these?" Rosalie hesitated before answering honestly. "I did." The man smiled with genuine admiration. "You have remarkable hands. Flowers reveal the heart of the person arranging them." Before Rosalie could respond, Vivian approached with effortless grace. "My daughters inherited their father's artistic eye," she explained smoothly, placing one hand upon Clarissa's shoulder. "The displays reflect our family's shared efforts." Rosalie remained silent. The gardener offered a respectful nod, unaware of the truth. As the afternoon continued, guests wandered through the exhibition praising the Winford floral displays, many stopping longest before the centerpiece Rosalie had rescued despite its missing roses. Hidden among the gathering crowd, Duke Theodore Ashcroft arrived quietly beside several members of the Royal Botanical Council. As conversations unfolded around him, his attention drifted not toward Clarissa gracefully accepting compliments, nor Penelope eagerly greeting noble visitors, but toward a young woman wearing a simple brown dress who knelt beside the displays, gently straightening a single bent stem before anyone else even noticed it. Theodore watched her for a thoughtful moment as an unfamiliar certainty settled quietly within him. Sometimes true elegance announced itself without asking anyone to look. As afternoon sunlight poured through the towering glass roof of the exhibition pavilion, the Royal Court exhibition reached its grand opening, and every conversation seemed to merge into one elegant current of admiration, ambition, and quiet competition. Noble families strolled beneath banners embroidered with golden crests while musicians filled the gardens with graceful melodies carried by the sea breeze drifting in from Blackstone Bay. Along polished marble walkways, judges from the Royal Botanical Council examined each floral presentation with careful attention, recording observations in leather-bound ledgers as attendants announced the names of distinguished exhibitors. Vivian Winford moved through the gathering with practiced confidence, accepting compliments, as though every arrangement displayed before the court reflected years of her own devotion. Clarissa and Penelope greeted influential ladies with polished smiles, carefully positioning themselves wherever photographers and artists gathered to sketch memorable moments from the celebration. Rosalie remained almost unnoticed near the outer edge of the pavilion, quietly replacing wilted leaves, refreshing crystal vases with clean water, and ensuring that every flower continued to bloom as beautifully as possible beneath the warming afternoon sun. She found comfort in the work itself. Flowers never demanded recognition. They simply gave everything they possessed before fading with dignity. A young palace attendant hurried toward her carrying a silver tray lined with delicate porcelain cups. "Excuse me, miss," he whispered politely. "The Western Fountain display has lost one of its floral garlands. The judges are approaching. Would you know how to repair it?" Rosalie nodded immediately. "Please show me." Within minutes she knelt beside the marble fountain where several expensive blossoms had loosened from their woven arrangement after an unexpected gust of coastal wind. Working quickly yet gently, she selected fresh vines, tucked white roses between soft greenery, and restored the entire garland with such natural balance that even experienced gardeners paused to admire the transformation. One elderly judge smiled with quiet approval. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured to another council member. "Who prepared this?" Before Rosalie could answer, Clarissa stepped gracefully forward. "Our family believes every detail matters," she replied with effortless confidence. "My mother insists perfection begins with patience." The judges offered respectful nods, unaware that the quiet young woman still kneeling beside the fountain had completed the work herself. Rosalie lowered her eyes and returned to organizing the remaining flowers without correcting anyone. Nearby, Duke Theodore Ashcroft observed the entire exchange in thoughtful silence. He had watched enough estate managers and noble hosts throughout the years to recognize the difference between those who accepted praise and those who quietly earned it. His gaze lingered upon Rosalie not because she sought attention but because she seemed entirely unconcerned with receiving any. As the afternoon progressed, the exhibition reached its most anticipated event. The royal court would soon arrive to view the grand displays before announcing which estates would receive the crown's highest recognition for horticultural excellence. Servants hurried through the pavilion making final adjustments, while distinguished guests gathered near the central gallery where hundreds of rare flowers formed a magnificent circular display beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. Vivian quietly gathered Clarissa and Penelope away from the crowd. Her voice remained calm, yet every word carried deliberate purpose. "Remember," she said, "the court must see only confidence. There cannot be distractions." Penelope glanced toward Rosalie arranging fresh blossoms near the entrance. "She still attracts too much attention, even dressed like that." Vivian followed her daughter's gaze before opening a small velvet pouch hidden inside her sleeve. Resting within lay an elegant sapphire brooch surrounded by tiny diamonds, one of the family's most valuable heirlooms and a favorite conversation piece among noble guests. Clarissa immediately understood the silent meaning behind her mother's expression. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly. Vivian closed the pouch with measured precision. "Sometimes the easiest way to hide the truth is to place it where no one expects to find it." Rosalie remained unaware of their conversation as she continued helping elderly gardeners carry fresh arrangements toward the central gallery. One of the palace florists thanked her warmly. "You have saved half this exhibition today." Rosalie smiled gently. The flowers deserved every chance to be seen at their best. Theodore heard those simple words while passing nearby, and something about them remained with him long after the conversation ended. They sounded neither rehearsed nor intended for admiration. They reflected the quiet character of someone who believed beauty existed to be shared rather than possessed. Moments later, the sound of ceremonial trumpets echoed across the palace gardens. Every conversation ceased. Noble guests straightened their posture as members of the royal court entered beneath towering marble arches. Velvet robes shimmered beneath afternoon light, while distinguished advisors, judges, and honored guests followed in measured procession. The entire pavilion seemed to hold its breath. Rosalie instinctively stepped farther behind the displays, hoping not to obstruct anyone's view. At that very moment, as every eye turned toward the arriving court, an unseen hand slipped silently through the gathered crowd with a single purpose, and somewhere among the sea of elegant gowns and polished uniforms, a carefully prepared deception quietly took its final place. The arrival of the royal court transformed the exhibition into a sea of perfect stillness where every polished shoe seemed reluctant to disturb the marble floors and every whispered conversation disappeared beneath the weight of expectation. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm afternoon light across hundreds of blossoms, filling the great pavilion with the fragrance of roses, lilies, and orange blossoms from estates across the kingdom. Members of the Royal Botanical Council escorted distinguished guests from one display to another while scribes carefully recorded each observation that might influence the crown's highest horticultural honor. Rosalie remained beside the outer arrangements, quietly replacing a single drooping stem before stepping back to ensure every flower faced the light. She had no desire to be noticed. Seeing the gardens flourish was reward enough. Vivian, however, watched the gathering with patient calculation. She exchanged graceful greetings with influential ladies while subtly guiding Clarissa and Penelope toward the center of every important conversation. Whenever a judge admired the Winford displays, Vivian responded with practiced humility, allowing her daughters to accept compliments that had never truly belonged to them. Not far away, Duke Theodore Ashcroft continued observing the exhibition with thoughtful reserve. Unlike many noble guests, he spent little time discussing prestige or awards. Instead, his attention repeatedly returned to the quiet young woman whose simple brown dress contrasted sharply with the elegance surrounding her. Each time a vase required straightening or a blossom needed gentle care, she appeared without hesitation, working with remarkable precision before disappearing once more into the background. It was as though she believed beauty deserved attention, while she did not. Theodore found the contrast impossible to ignore. The ceremony progressed until the Lord Chamberlain paused before the central gallery to recognize several outstanding displays. As applause echoed beneath the glass ceiling, palace attendants moved carefully through the crowd serving refreshments upon polished silver trays. During the gentle movement of guests exchanging places to improve their view, Vivian brushed lightly past Rosalie. The contact seemed entirely accidental, no different from countless polite encounters taking place throughout the pavilion. Rosalie instinctively stepped aside to avoid interrupting anyone's path before continuing toward a nearby arrangement where several orchids required fresh water. Only Vivian knew that the sapphire brooch no longer rested inside her velvet pouch. Moments later a sharp gasp rose from Clarissa. She pressed both hands against her bodice before speaking loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Mother, your sapphire brooch is gone." Conversation slowed. Vivian immediately touched the empty place where the heirloom had supposedly been secured moments earlier. Her expression reflected perfect surprise mixed with carefully measured concern. "That cannot be possible," she answered. "I had it only a short while ago." Palace attendants politely offered assistance while nearby guests exchanged uncertain glances. One elderly noblewoman remarked that such treasured heirlooms rarely disappeared without reason. Vivian remained composed. "I am certain no one here would intentionally dishonor this gathering," she said gently. "Perhaps it simply fell during the preparations." Yet even as she spoke, her eyes drifted almost imperceptibly toward Rosalie. Penelope followed the silent cue with convincing hesitation. "Rosalie was helping move the flower crates," she said quietly. "She was near us throughout the afternoon." The words were not spoken as an accusation, only as a simple observation, yet they floated through the surrounding crowd with astonishing speed. Several palace attendants looked toward Rosalie, who had just finished filling a crystal vase beside the eastern display. She noticed the unusual silence before realizing dozens of unfamiliar eyes had turned in her direction. A senior palace steward approached respectfully. "Miss Winford," he said with calm professionalism, "would you kindly step forward for a moment?" Rosalie obeyed without hesitation, drying her hands upon a linen cloth before walking toward the gathering. Theodore watched the scene unfold from several yards away. Something about the sudden shift in atmosphere unsettled him. He had attended enough formal proceedings to recognize when genuine concern differed from carefully arranged appearances. The steward addressed the crowd with quiet courtesy. "A valuable family heirloom appears to be missing. We are certain this matter can be resolved quickly." Vivian lowered her eyes with graceful restraint. "Please understand, I seek no embarrassment for anyone. I merely hope the brooch may be found." The steward nodded before turning once more toward Rosalie. "Would you permit us to confirm that it has not been placed among the flower linens by mistake?" Rosalie answered immediately. "Of course." She offered the folded apron she had been wearing while arranging flowers. The steward examined its pockets first. They were empty except for a small pair of gardening shears and a neatly folded handkerchief embroidered with her late father's initials. Several guests relaxed, believing the misunderstanding already resolved. Then, as the steward lifted the edge of the linen cloth draped over Rosalie's flower basket, a brilliant flash of deep blue caught the afternoon light. Resting quietly among freshly cut white carnations lay Vivian's sapphire brooch, its diamonds scattering shimmering reflections across the polished marble floor. A collective breath swept through the pavilion, and in the sudden silence that followed, every eye turned toward Rosalie while Theodore's calm expression grew noticeably more intent, not because he believed what he had seen, but because nothing about the young woman standing before the court matched the accusation now silently forming around her. Silence settled across the exhibition hall with a weight heavier than any spoken accusation. The sapphire brooch rested among the white carnations like a single drop of midnight fallen into fresh snow, its polished stones reflecting hundreds of uncertain faces gathered beneath the towering glass ceiling. No one moved. Even the musicians in the distant gallery lowered their instruments, as whispers spread from one end of the pavilion to the other. Rosalie stared at the jeweled heirloom without reaching toward it, her expression revealing only quiet disbelief. She had never seen the brooch inside her basket before that very moment. The senior palace steward carefully lifted the piece of jewelry with a white linen glove before examining it beneath the afternoon light. "Lady Vivian," he said respectfully, "can you confirm this is your family's heirloom?" Vivian stepped forward with measured grace, allowing just enough sadness to soften her composed expression. "Yes," she answered gently. "It belonged to my husband's mother. It has remained within our family for generations." She paused before looking toward Rosalie with eyes that appeared more disappointed than angry. "Child, if you admired it, all you needed to do was ask." The words struck the gathering more deeply than any direct accusation could have. Several guests exchanged sympathetic glances toward Vivian, while others quietly lowered their eyes, already deciding what they believed had happened. Clarissa sighed softly, as though struggling to accept an unpleasant truth. "We never imagined anything like this," Penelope added in a trembling voice. "She has always spent so much time alone. Perhaps she simply wished to feel beautiful for one evening." Their carefully chosen words painted a picture that required no further explanation. Rosalie finally found her voice, calm despite the growing storm surrounding her. "I did not place that brooch inside my basket." Her words carried neither panic nor anger. They were spoken with simple honesty. The steward regarded her respectfully. "Miss Winford, do you know how it might have appeared there?" Rosalie slowly shook her head. "No, sir. I do not." Another murmur passed through the crowd. To many ears, the answer sounded painfully incomplete. People often expected innocence to defend itself with desperate emotion. Rosalie offered only the truth she possessed, and the truth alone suddenly seemed far too quiet against the weight of visible evidence. Vivian lowered her gaze once more. "I would prefer this matter remain private," she said with remarkable dignity. "The exhibition should not be overshadowed by family sorrow." Her restraint earned immediate admiration. Several noblewomen approached to comfort her while praising her generosity for refusing to humiliate her stepdaughter further. Rosalie listened without interrupting. Each kind word offered to Vivian seemed to build another invisible wall between herself and everyone surrounding her. Mr. Edwin Hale, who had finally reached the central gallery after tending the transport wagons, looked from Rosalie to the brooch with visible confusion. "There must be some mistake," he said firmly. "I have known Miss Winford since she was a little girl. She would never—" Before he could finish, one member of the Royal Botanical Council gently raised a hand. "Master Hale, your loyalty honors you. But we must also respect what has been found." Edwin fell silent, unable to argue against evidence lying plainly before every witness. Rosalie turned toward him and offered the faintest shake of her head, silently asking him not to continue defending her. She would not allow another person to suffer embarrassment because of her. At the edge of the gathering, Duke Theodore Ashcroft had not spoken a single word. His gray eyes moved carefully from the brooch to the flower basket, then toward Vivian, Clarissa, Penelope, and finally back to Rosalie. He noticed details that others overlooked. Rosalie had shown surprise before anyone announced where the brooch had been discovered. Her hands remained steady instead of instinctively reaching to hide the basket. Most telling of all, she never once looked toward the jewelry itself with either fear or longing. She looked only confused. Theodore had spent years settling disputes across his northern estates. Experience had taught him that appearances often arrived long before truth. The Lord Chamberlain stepped forward, his voice measured and impartial. Until this matter is clarified, I ask that all parties remain within the palace grounds. No conclusions shall be reached without proper review. Vivian bowed her head gracefully. A wise decision. Clarissa and Penelope exchanged quick glances before lowering their eyes in carefully practiced sorrow. Around them, conversations resumed in hushed voices. Some guests pitied Rosalie. Others quietly condemned her. Many simply accepted the story forming before them because it appeared easier than questioning it. Rosalie stood alone beside the flower arrangements she had spent countless hours creating. The same blossoms that had filled the pavilion with beauty now surrounded her like silent witnesses unable to speak on her behalf. A single white rose loosened from its display and drifted gently to the marble floor at her feet. She bent to pick it up before placing it carefully back into the arrangement, almost as though the flower deserved comfort more than she did. Theodore watched that simple gesture, and in that quiet moment a certainty settled within him with greater strength than any accusation echoing through the exhibition hall. The court had seen a brooch inside a basket. He had seen something entirely different. He had seen a woman whose character remained unchanged even when every eye around her had begun to believe the worst. The murmur spreading through the pavilion slowly faded as Duke Theodore Ashcroft stepped away from the circle of noble guests, and walked toward the center of the marble gallery with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. Every polished boot echoed softly against the stone floor until even the servants paused to watch. Members of the royal court instinctively made room for him, recognizing both his rank and the quiet authority he carried wherever he went. Rosalie remained where she stood beside the flower display, her hands folded gently before her, while the white rose she had returned to its arrangement swayed almost imperceptibly beneath the warm breeze drifting through the open glass panels. Vivian lowered her eyes respectfully as Theodore approached, believing the Duke had come to preserve the dignity of the occasion. Clarissa and Penelope exchanged almost invisible smiles, certain that no distinguished nobleman would willingly associate himself with a woman already standing beneath suspicion. Theodore stopped several feet from Rosalie and looked first toward the senior palace steward. "May I ask a question before this gathering proceeds further?" His calm voice carried effortlessly across the silent hall. "Of course, Your Grace," the steward replied. Theodore turned toward the flower basket still resting upon the marble floor. "Who first discovered the brooch?" The steward answered honestly. "I lifted the linen covering after Lady Vivian reported the missing heirloom. The brooch was found beneath the flowers." Theodore nodded thoughtfully. "Did anyone witness Miss Winford placing it there?" The steward hesitated before answering. "No, Your Grace." Theodore allowed several quiet seconds to pass. "Has anyone asked whether another person handled the basket before it was examined?" The question lingered in the air like the fragrance of fresh lilies. Several attendants glanced at one another before slowly shaking their heads. Theodore continued without changing his measured tone. "Today I have observed this exhibition from its opening ceremony until this very moment. I have watched noble families accept admiration, gardeners restore damaged displays, and attendants perform countless acts of service. During those hours I noticed something that appears absent from this discussion." Vivian lifted her gaze with carefully composed concern. "Your Grace, no one wishes to cause unnecessary hardship." Theodore acknowledged her words with a polite inclination of his head before continuing. "Neither do I. Which is precisely why hardship should never be built upon assumption." He looked toward Rosalie. "Miss Winford, when the steward requested your basket, did you object?" "No, Your Grace." "Did you attempt to conceal its contents?" "No." "Did you request time to remove anything from it?" "No." Theodore nodded once more. "Thank you." The simplicity of the exchange unsettled many who had expected a lengthy defense. Theodore then turned toward the Royal Botanical Council. "Earlier today I witnessed this young woman repairing damaged floral arrangements, assisting palace gardeners without recognition, and restoring displays credited to others. Not once did she seek applause. Not once did she claim work that belonged to her. Such habits are not easily abandoned in the span of a single afternoon. quiet uncertainty began to ripple through the crowd. Several gardeners exchanged thoughtful glances, remembering how often Rosalie had worked unnoticed throughout the day. Mr. Edwin Hale lowered his head, grateful that someone of influence had finally spoken. Vivian answered with graceful restraint. Character can sometimes surprise even those closest to us, Your Grace. Theodore regarded her steadily. Indeed it can. Then, without another word, he stepped forward until he stood directly before Rosalie. She looked at him with quiet confusion, uncertain why the Duke himself had entered a matter that seemed certain to end in her disgrace. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire pavilion fell into absolute silence. Theodore slowly extended his gloved hand toward her. Gasps echoed softly across the marble gallery. No one moved. Rosalie hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because she could not understand why a man of his standing would offer such a gesture while suspicions still surrounded her. His voice remained calm, caring only for her to hear, though many nearby caught the words. A person abandoned by truth stands alone only until someone chooses to stand beside them. Rosalie looked into his steady gray eyes and saw neither pity nor hesitation. She saw trust. Slowly she placed her hand in his. Theodore closed his fingers gently around hers before turning to face the gathered court without releasing her hand. The gesture required no dramatic declaration. It carried more weight than any speech. Noble guests who had quietly stepped away from Rosalie only moments earlier now watched in stunned silence, as one of the kingdom's most respected dukes openly chose to stand beside the very woman everyone else had begun to avoid. Clarissa's confident expression vanished. Penelope's smile disappeared completely. Even Vivian's carefully practiced composure faltered for the briefest instant before returning behind another graceful mask. Theodore addressed the court with quiet certainty. Until truth is established, Miss Winford shall stand beneath my personal protection. No judgment worthy of this court should ever be delivered before every question has been asked. No one challenged him. The royal court remained silent. The judges lowered their pens. The musicians forgot their next notes. Across the pavilion, sunlight poured through the towering glass roof and settled upon the white roses surrounding Rosalie, while the simple brown dress that had made her nearly invisible all day no longer mattered. For the first time since entering the exhibition, every person present truly saw her. The silence that followed Duke Theodore Ashcroft's declaration lingered beneath the glass ceiling long enough for every person inside the pavilion to understand that the afternoon had changed forever. Rosalie still stood beside him, her hand resting lightly within his, while the fragrance of white roses drifted through the warm air as though the flowers themselves refused to surrender their quiet grace to suspicion. The Lord Chamberlain slowly stepped forward, his expression thoughtful rather than hurried. Your Grace, he said respectfully, if you possess information relevant to this matter, the royal court welcomes it. Theodore released Rosalie's hand only after giving her a reassuring nod that required no words. He turned calmly toward the assembled judges, advisors, and noble families. Several months ago, he began, my estate office received correspondence concerning unusual financial changes within the Winford holdings after the passing of the late Edmund Winford. Vivian's composed smile faded almost imperceptibly. Theodore continued without raising his voice. The letters did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. They simply described an estate that had once supported local gardeners, fishermen, and village families but had quietly withdrawn nearly all charitable assistance while continuing to present an image of generosity. A senior member of the Royal Botanical Council exchanged curious glances with another judge. Theodore nodded toward his steward, who stepped forward carrying a polished leather portfolio. Because the Winford Conservatory had long been recognized as one of the finest botanical collections along the northern coast, I asked my steward to make discreet inquiries before approving a regional horticultural grant requested earlier this spring. The steward respectfully opened the portfolio and withdrew several neatly organized documents. We interviewed merchants, gardeners, suppliers, and neighboring estate managers, he explained. Their statements were remarkably consistent. Theodore accepted one page before continuing. Every account described the same young woman rising before dawn, maintaining the conservatory almost alone, restoring neglected gardens, delivering flowers to the village chapel without requesting payment, and providing arrangements for families unable to afford them. Soft murmurs spread once more through the gallery, but these whispers carried surprise instead of suspicion. Mr. Edwin Hale quietly lowered his eyes, recognizing every description as true. Theodore looked toward Rosalie only briefly before addressing the court again. Curiously, every witness identified the same person. He paused. Miss Rosalie Winford. Clarissa shifted uneasily while Penelope avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Vivian remained motionless, though the confidence she had displayed throughout the exhibition had begun to disappear beneath growing uncertainty. Theodore continued. Not one witness credited Lady Vivienne or her daughters for the botanical achievements presented here today. Every arrangement receiving praise during this exhibition bears the unmistakable style repeatedly attributed to Miss Winford. One elderly palace gardener stepped forward unexpectedly. Your Grace speaks truth, he said respectfully. When the fountain garland failed earlier today, it was Miss Winford who restored it. Lady Clarissa accepted the compliments afterward, but she never touched the arrangement. Another gardener bowed politely. The centerpiece display also reflected Miss Winford's work. I observed her rebuilding it after several roses had been removed before judging began. Theodore listened without interruption. The Lord Chamberlain nodded thoughtfully as additional attendants quietly confirmed similar observations. None of them accused Vivian directly. They simply described what they had personally witnessed throughout the day. Theodore then turned toward the senior palace steward. One question remains unanswered. The steward inclined his head. Your Grace? Theodore spoke with measured clarity. If Miss Winford intended to steal a priceless family heirloom, why would she leave it resting openly beneath white carnations inside the very basket she willingly presented for inspection? Why would she either conceal it nor deny access to the basket? Such actions do not resemble careful theft. They resemble someone unaware the object was ever placed there. The question settled heavily across the pavilion. Several members of the royal court slowly reconsidered everything they had assumed only minutes earlier. Vivian finally answered, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. Surely coincidence cannot erase what was discovered. Theodore met her gaze calmly. Nor should appearance replace reason. He gestured gently toward the basket. Anyone passing beside those flowers during a crowded exhibition could have reached them unnoticed. We have evidence that the brooch was found there. We do not possess evidence identifying who placed it there. The Lord Chamberlain folded his hands thoughtfully. That distinction is significant. Theodore nodded once. Justice begins with such distinctions. For several quiet moments no one spoke. Then one elderly judge closed his ledger before addressing the gathering. This court recognizes exemplary character as readily as exceptional horticulture. Character has been discussed here today with greater certainty than evidence permits. He looked toward Rosalie. Miss Winford, the court regrets that conclusions appeared ready to outrun truth. Rosalie bowed her head gently. Thank you, sir. She neither demanded apologies nor looked toward Vivian with triumph. Her humility seemed to deepen the silence even further. Theodore noticed that simple grace more than anyone else. Many people revealed their hearts when honored. Others revealed them when humiliated. Rosalie had remained the same in both moments. As late afternoon sunlight bathed the pavilion in soft gold, the balance of the entire gathering quietly shifted. Only one final truth still remained hidden, and somewhere behind carefully lowered eyes, Vivian understood that the story she had so carefully arranged was beginning to unravel thread by thread. The final hours of the Royal Court exhibition unfolded beneath a sky washed with golden light as the sun slowly descended toward the Northumberland cliffs, filling the great glass pavilion with a quiet warmth that seemed to soften every polished marble column and every blooming flower. The Lord Chamberlain carefully reviewed the statements gathered from the palace gardeners, attendants, and members of the Royal Botanical Council before addressing the assembled guests one final time. This court has found no evidence proving that Miss Rosalie Winford knowingly possessed Lady Vivian's brooch, he announced with calm authority. On the contrary, Today's testimony consistently recognizes her integrity, her remarkable skill, and her service throughout this exhibition. Therefore, no accusation shall remain against her name." A gentle wave of relieved conversation spread across the hall, replacing the uneasy whispers that had shadowed the afternoon. Several noble guests who had quietly turned away from Rosalie earlier now approached with sincere expressions of regret. The elderly judge who had admired the floral displays bowed respectfully before her. "Miss Winford, your work has honored this exhibition far more than we realized. Please accept my apology for allowing appearances to cloud proper judgment." Rosalie answered with the same quiet grace that had carried her through every difficult moment. "Thank you, sir. I hope only that the flowers brought peace to everyone who visited today." Her response surprised many who expected resentment. Instead, they found only humility. Theodore watched her with growing admiration, understanding that kindness preserved after hardship possessed a beauty no title could ever bestow. Vivian remained silent, her carefully constructed image now cracked by the weight of countless quiet truths. She attempted to gather Clarissa and Penelope toward the carriage entrance, hoping to leave before further attention settled upon them, but the Lord Chamberlain politely requested that the family remain a little longer while the exhibition awards were completed. One by one, the Royal Botanical Council announced honors recognizing innovation, preservation, and artistic excellence. When the highest distinction of the afternoon finally arrived, the senior judge stepped forward holding an engraved crystal medallion suspended from a deep blue ribbon. "This year's Royal Award for Botanical Excellence is presented not to an estate, but to the individual whose craftsmanship, devotion, and generosity best reflect the spirit of the Crown's gardens." He paused before smiling warmly. "Miss Rosalie Winford." For a moment Rosalie simply stood in quiet disbelief. The entire pavilion rose in heartfelt applause that echoed beneath the towering glass roof. Palace gardeners smiled proudly. Mr. Edwin Hale wiped away a discreet tear before joining the applause with both hands. Theodore remained beside her, his expression calm, though unmistakable pride rested in his eyes. Rosalie accepted the crystal medallion with gentle hands. "I am deeply honored," she said softly. "Everything I know about caring for flowers was taught to me by my father. I hope I have honored his memory today." Even those who had never met Edmund Winford felt the sincerity within her words. After the ceremony concluded, guests slowly drifted into the palace gardens where evening sunlight painted the roses with shades of amber and gold. Theodore approached Rosalie near the fountain she had repaired earlier that day. The restored garland still circled the marble basin as though no storm had ever threatened it. "You cared for every flower here," he said quietly, "even while no one cared for your reputation." Rosalie looked toward the calm water reflecting the evening sky. "Flowers cannot defend themselves," she answered. "Someone has to choose kindness first." Theodore smiled faintly. "That is exactly why I came to speak with you." He reached into his coat and unfolded an elegant parchment bearing the Ashcroft family seal. Ashcroft Manor has stood above Blackstone Bay for more than 200 years. Behind the manor rests an historic walled garden that has not fully bloomed since my mother's passing. I have searched for someone capable of restoring it, but I have realized that skill alone is not enough. A garden reflects the heart of the person tending it. Rosalie accepted the letter carefully. "You would trust me with such a place?" "I already do," Theodore answered. Not because of what happened today, but because of everything he chose to do long before anyone was watching. The evening breeze carried the scent of roses across the gardens as they walked together toward the palace gates, either rushing the silence between them nor filling it with unnecessary promises. Behind them, the exhibition lights slowly illuminated the conservatory displays one final time, while ahead, the distant cliffs overlooking Blackstone Bay glowed beneath the fading sunset. Windermere Glass Conservatory would remain part of Rosalie's story, but it would no longer be the place where her future ended. It would become the place where her quiet strength had finally been seen. As the first evening stars appeared above the northern coast, Theodore and Rosalie paused for one last look at the sea before continuing toward the waiting carriage, and somewhere beyond the gentle sound of the waves, It seemed as though the flowers her father had once planted were whispering the same timeless truth carried by every season: some hearts are admired because they shine. But the rarest hearts are remembered because they remain kind even after the world has given them every reason not to.